Hi, this is Jeff Mann, and I'm going to be producing a new video on the topic of the different hand release actions professional golfers use in the early follow-through. And this is episode 7 of my video project, where I, as an amateur golf theorist, express my opinions about the golf swing biomechanics used by professional golfers. Now, I'm going to start off with this image here of Will Zalatoris. And in image 1, you can see he's at the P6 position, image 2 at P6.5, and here he is approaching impact in image 3. Now, Will Zalatoris uses a weak lead hand grip. You can see that there. And he uses what I call the intact left forearm flying wedge technique combined with a geometrically flat left wrist. And you can see that his left wrist here remains geometrically flat. And as he releases the club shaft at all times during his downswing, if you drew a line, is in line with his radial bone as it is here. And that represents the intact left forearm flying wedge technique. Now, when Will Zalatoris comes to P6.5, you'll notice that his club face is still open relative to his club head path and relative to the ball target line. And to get a square club face at impact, you can see where I'm wiggling my mouse, he has to perform a lead forearm supinatory motion. So if you look at this image here, the logo on his glove, and you can see how much he rotated it counterclockwise in order to square the club face. And this phenomenon is called, in TGN terms, a power accumulator number 3 release phenomenon. And that's just the phenomenon that professional golfers use to square the face if they use a weak or neutral lead hand grip. Now, when I talk about hand release actions, I'm not referring to this part of the release. So from P6 to impact, there are 2 release phenomena happening. The one is the release of the club, which in TGM terms is called the release of power accumulator number 2. And the second part of the release is power accumulator number 3 release, where the lead forearm supinates in order to square the club face. And while that is happening, the club is continuing to release, but the club shaft is rotating counterclockwise about its longitudinal axis so that the club face can become square at impact. Now I'm going to go on to the next image. And this is an image of Will Zalatoris's hand release action. So here he is at impact. Here he is roughly at P7.4, and here he is at probably about P7.7. Now, when I talk about a hand release, I'm talking about mainly from P7 to P7.2 is the critical period. I want to know what are the hands doing in that time period. But I also sometimes extend it beyond P7.2 and say, well, what is happening in terms of the hand release action up to P7.4? So it's in the 2 feet of club head travel between impact and, let's say, P7.4. And if you look at this image of Will Zalatoris, you can see he's using what I call a drive hold hand release action. Now, the word drive hold, I first came across it from a golf instructor called Calvin Miyahira, and he used the word drive hold. And I like the term because if you look at him at impact here, he's obviously driving through impact into his early follow through, but he's holding this angle. So if you look at his lead arm and the club shaft, he's not allowing the club shaft to bypass his lead arm. So I also use the term drive hold, but I have a different definition. And my definition of a drive hold hand release action is that if you look at the club shaft in the early follow through to P7.2 or even up to P7.4, if you can prevent the club shaft from bypassing your lead arm, that represents a drive hold hand release action. And if you watch what happens to the club face, notice how the club face remains square to the club head path post impact. And that's, to me, a huge advantage of this technique, is that you're controlling it. Another point to notice, at impact, he has an intact left forearm flying wedge and a geometrically flat wrist, and he's maintaining it into the follow through. There's a slight degree of lead wrist palmar flexion here. So you would say the club shaft's not absolutely perfectly in line with his radial bone, but I regard that as being close enough to represent an intact left forearm flying wedge and a geometrically flat left wrist. Now, I'm going to go into more detail about what's actually happening at the level of his hands during this period, but I'm going to go to the next image. And this is an image of a YouTube video produced by Rob Cheney called The Release System That Builds Tour Quality Ball Striking. And if you type this title here into YouTube's search engine there, you'll be able to find this YouTube video. And I highly recommend that you watch this video, because I think that Rob Cheney does an excellent job of showing how to learn how to perform a drive hold hand release action. And he calls it the 3 releases because he says the first thing you have to learn is to get to this position 1 here. And you can see he looks very similar to Will Zalatoris, that the club shaft is still in line with his lead arm. And he says you need to practice this till you get very efficient in doing it. Then he says once you've learned that part of the release phenomenon, the hand release action in the early follow through, then he talks about this phenomenon, which he calls the second phase of the release. And finally, that's the third phase of the release. Now, I'm going to show you some images from his video. I'll go to the next image. So here are capture images that I made from the Rob Cheney's video. And you can see here he is almost at P7.8, and you can see the club shafts still in line with his lead arm, and he's not allowing the club shaft to bypass his lead arm from an angular rotational perspective. And here he's obviously exaggerating, and he's getting all the way nearly to P7.8. But I said if you can get to even P7.4 doing that, that fits my definition of a drive hold hand release action. And that's the first phase of his hand release action technique. Now in phase 2, you can see in image 2 here and image 3 what he recommends. So he says once you get to a point, let's say at P7.4 or P7.6 or P7.8, you need to start cocking up your hands. But the way he says you need to cock your hands up is to make sure that the club shaft never bypasses your lead arm. So look at what he looks like in image 3. He's gone from image 1, he's radially deviating both his lead wrist and his trail wrist, and that causes the club shaft to become steep. And that's often referred to as the P9 position. But if you look at it from this upline view, notice that the club shaft is tilted in this direction. And that's unusual because most golfers who perform a hand release action, as they bypass the P7.4 position, they'll start to swivel the club shaft onto the swing plane, and the club shaft will be angled back, as I'll demonstrate later. Then the third phase of his hand release action is from this position, he starts to fold his lead arm. So he had a straight arm there. Now he's folding it, and then the right arm folds as well. The most important thing to look here is the club shaft, even if it goes over your head or behind your neck, it never bypasses the lead arm. Notice that his lead wrist here is bending a lot, in this position. And this appearance is called a hold-off release action. In other words, he's holding it off. And there are many professional golfers who use this technique. And a classic example was Arnold Palmer, in the area that he played professional golf around 1960, and he used this technique. And a lot of professional golfers today also use this technique, particularly with the short irons. Some of them use it with a driver, but not too many, because it's technically not easy to perform a release action where you get all the way beyond P7.9 without swiveling it onto the plane. Now I'm going to go to the next image. And I mentioned to you that Rob Cheney, once the release phenomenon, so he says when you get to about P6 or somewhere around between P4 and P8, you're going to start to lift the club up by cocking your wrists up. And in the previous demonstration, he kept the club shaft sort of facing up and never bypassing his lead arm. But what I wanted to demonstrate here, these are two images I captured from another swing video that he made. And you'll notice that he's doing something very different in this one. In other words, if you look at the club shaft here, it's definitely leaning away from the ball target line, much more than his hold-off finish action type of swing action. And this is a very common phenomenon I see in professional golfers. So even if they use a drive hold hand release action like Will Zalatoris, and they get to P7.4 with the club shaft not bypassing the lead arm, as they get beyond P7.4, they often perform this phenomenon where you can see the lead forearm is supinating and the trail forearm is pronating, so that the trail palm rolls over a supinating lead hand. And I refer to this phenomenon as the release swivel action. And I think that's an option. In other words, you don't have to do a hold-off swivel action, as I previously demonstrated, that Rob Cheney was demonstrating, and it's perfectly permissible to use this release swivel action in the later follow through after P8, even if you decided to use a drive hold in the early follow through. I'm now going to go to the next image. And this is an image, and I would really encourage you to watch that video by Rob Cheney. So what he's done in this image is he put a hack motion device on his lead wrist. And what he is attempting to demonstrate, you'll notice here he's looking to the side because he's doing a drill to show you how you can go from impact to this position, which is probably at about P7.7. And he says the whole idea is you don't allow the club shaft to bypass your lead arm. And that is my definition of a drive hold hand release action, except I don't believe you need to go that far. If you can get to P7.4, that's extremely good. Now, you can see over here, he's got an extension value on the hack motion that's measuring flexion and extension of 15 degrees of extension. And then he gets to this position, and the reading is 14 degrees of extension. So he's looking obviously over his shoulder now at the screen because he's looking to see what the measurements are. And what he's trying to do is to keep his lead wrist from bending, he says. Now, if you look at this, you would say, well, what he seems to be demonstrating is true, that the club shaft from P7 to here, P7.7, he's not bending his lead wrist more. But I'm going to show you that this is a big error, because what the hack motion device does is it measures the extension of your wrist irrespective of its motion. So if you look at him here at address, he's got forward shaft lean, right? And he uses a moderately strong grip. And if you use a moderately strong grip, it would not be surprising that your lead wrist would be cupped by 15 degrees at impact. But if you talk about does that mean that the club shaft is bypassing his lead arm? And you can see, if you look at his lead arm here, he has forward shaft lean despite the fact that his lead wrist is extension. So what the hack motion device is actually doing, it's measuring lead wrist extension, and it's not really measuring lead wrist extension, it's measuring the degree of dorsiflexion, the degree of cupping of your lead wrist. So he has a cupped lead wrist here because he has a moderately strong lead and grip. When he gets to this position, his lead wrist is still cupped because he has a moderately strong lead and grip. And the hack motion device, which he interprets as proving that the lead wrist is not bending in his follow-through, is totally wrong. And I'll show you what I mean by going to the next image. So here we are at the next image. So what I've done here, I just drew a red line down his lead arm and to the ground, and you notice that he has forward shaft lean. Here he is at this P7 position, and I've drawn a red line down his lead arm, and you can see the club shaft is on the other side of this red line. Now, this red line that I've drawn on is not perfectly accurate, because when you draw lines on a 2D image, there's a problem with parallax distortion. So it's not meant to give you precise values. But what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that his lead wrist is moving in this plane, the plane of the lead arm towards a greater degree of extension. In other words, he's not maintaining an intact flying wedge. Here, the club shaft at this point is bypassed his left arm. So these values that he gets from the hack motion device are not true. They don't reflect the fact whether the golfer has an intact left arm flying wedge or whether the club shaft is bypassing the left arm. And I'll have more to say about this phenomenon later in this video presentation. I'm now going to go to the next image. And this is an image of Scotty Scheffler. Image 1, P6, image 2 at P6.5. And what I've drawn is a yellow line just to show more or less where his hands are at P6. And then I drew a green line to show where his hands are at P6.5. And here at impact, I've drawn a red line to show his hands. And here I've drawn a blue line to show where his hands are at P7.4. And that just gives you a rough idea of how fast he's moving his lead hand across his body during his late downswing and early follow through. Now, if you look at this image here at P7.4, he looks very different to Will Zalatoris. Remember, Will Zalatoris, if you go back and look at his image, the club shaft was still in line with the lead arm, and that was my definition of a drive, hold, hand release action. While here you can clearly see that the club shaft has bypassed his lead arm from an angular rotational perspective. And I refer to this type of hand release action as a flipping subtype of non-drive hold hand release action. So what he's doing between impact here, image 3, and 7.4 is he's allowing the club to release, and he's allowing his lead wrist to bend. You can see it's slightly more bent there, and it's bending, and therefore that doesn't represent a drive, hold, hand release action. But I believe that this technique is just as good as a drive, hold, hand release action. And the reason why I say this is if you look at his club face, which is square at impact, if you look at his in the early follow through between impact and P7.4, the club face is still square to his club head path. And the reason why that happens is that when he allows his lead wrist to bend more than Will Zalatoris's, it doesn't roll, it just bends more. And if you look at his trail wrist between P6.5 here, image 2, and impact, he's straightening his trail wrist. And he had a certain amount of counterclockwise circumductory roll motion during this period, because between P6.5 and impact, Scotty Scheffler had to perform a PA, power accumulator number 3 release action, which requires lead forearm supination to square his club face. Now, after impact, notice that his lead trail wrist here is even straighter. But between here at impact and in this position, the club shaft is not rotating more about its longitudinal axis. It's just moving there. So his trail wrist becomes straightening, but he doesn't have to roll it more. Now, this type of release action I regard as just as good as a drive, hold, hand release action. And I'm going to go to the next image. And this is an image of Rory McIlroy. And you'll notice that Rory McIlroy here, P6, P6.5, image 3 is at impact, and here he is at P7.4 in image 4. again, I've drawn these lines to give you a rough idea how fast his hands are moving through impact. You'll notice that the distance between these lines gets shorter. And if you look at Rory McIlroy when he gets to 7.4, he's not moving his lead arm targetwards as fast as Fuel Zalatoris. And what he's doing is he's allowing the club shaft to bypass his lead arm, just using what I call a flipping subtype of non-drive hold hand release action. And if you look at the club face, which is square at impact, it's still square here, just like Scotty Scheffler. And this technique, which I call the flipping subtype of non-drive hold hand release action, works wonderfully well. And I used to be a strong advocate of the drive hold hand release action because I thought that it was the perfect way to maintain a stable club face through impact where the club face stays square to the path. And I thought that would be advantage in terms of ensuring that you hit the ball straight. But I've revised my thinking over the years, and now I believe that if you use a flipping subtype like this, it's equally as good as a drive hold hand release action. So that's the second type of release action that professional golfers use. I'm going to go to the next image, and this is an image of Ernie Els. So here's Ernie Els in image 1 at impact. Here in image 2 is probably at about 7.2, 7.3, and here he is at P8 position. You'll notice that what Ernie Els is doing, he's performing a release swivel action. And you can see it's happening already before P8. So somewhere between about P7.4, he's performing a swivel action. And to perform a release swivel action, you can see he's supinating his lead forearm, and at the same time he's pronating his trail forearm, and the trail palm rolls over the club handle there. Now, this release swivel action is happening here. But what I'm going to show you in the next image, an interesting fact. So I'm sharing another image of Ernie Els' swing. And this one, I created an animated GIF, which means, I took a lot of images and superimposed them. And you can see what's happening here between P6 through impact to about P7.4. Now I'm going to describe what happens, and I'll have to do it a few times because it's hard to picture what's happening. So here he is at P6, back of his hands facing the target. Here he's starting to release the club, and the back of his hand is rotating to face the target at impact. I'll go back again. So he's using the intact left forearm flying wedge technique. And as he releases the club shaft remains in line with his lead lower forearm's radial bone. He comes into impact, he still has an intact left forearm flying wedge and a geometrically flat left wrist. Now I'm going to show you, you need to pay a lot of attention to what is actually happening between P7 here at impact and the next image at 7.2. You'll notice the club shaft doesn't seem to be bypassing his lead arm in this short time period, in the first foot post-impact. And he's not bending his lead wrist, but if you look very carefully, you'll notice there's a roll motion. Look at it. If you look at his radial bone, it's rolling counterclockwise. Now, you need to keep looking at this image, because if you're not experienced at looking at an image, it's hard for you to discern exactly what's happening here. Because I want you to notice that I mentioned that his radial bone is rotating counterclockwise. but it's not entirely due to a lead forearm supinatory action. There is also a certain amount of counterclockwise rotation of his humerus. And so in the early follow-through phase between P7 and 7.2, he's performing what I call a roll-in subtype of a non-drive hold hand release action. So if you look at it carefully as we'll go through it again, look at what's happening between P7 and 7.2 and look at his club face. You'll notice that the toe is slightly passing the heel. It's not staying perfectly square to the club head path as happens in a drive hold hand release action and as happens in a flipping subtype of hand release action. There's a certain amount of roll motion, and the roll motion is partly due to a certain degree of supination of the lead forearm and a certain amount of counterclockwise rotation of the lead humerus. But I want you now to notice what happens from here to the next image. You see he's starting to perform a release swivel action. So this release swivel action is happening much earlier than the release swivel action that Rob Cheney uses in his drive hold hand release action. Now I'm going to go to the next image. And this is an image of a golf instructor, Cristiano Ricci, who's demonstrating her hand release action technique. So you can see here she's at impact, and here she is at about P7.6. Notice she's performing a release swivel action. And if you actually had to watch what she's doing in her video, from here, even before P7.2, she is swiveling. She's performing a release swivel action immediately between P7 and 7.2 until by P7.4, P7.5, it's already completely swivel. Now, I don't see professional golfers doing that, because if you perform a release swivel action through impact, so you start to swivel from even, in other words, at this point, she's going to have, if she has a neutral or a weak lead hand grip, she's going to have to square the club face by performing a lead forearm supinatory motion so that she can get a square club face by impact. But what she continues to do is she continues to supinate non-stop through impact and ends up looking like that. And I am not in favor of this technique because the club face is rotating so fast through impact. I don't believe it's as stable as the other three techniques I mentioned. So I believe that the three techniques that professional golfers use are a drive hold hand release action. The second technique is the flipping subtype of non-drive hold hand release action, as used by Scotty Scheffler and Rory McIlroy, and I think many professional golfers. And the third release action is a rolling subtype of non-drive hold release action. When the club face rolls a lot through impact, like must be happening here, I refer to that as a roller subtype. And I believe that a roller subtype is suboptimum. I think a rolling subtype is performed by Ernie Els and Tiger Woods and many professional golfers like Luke Donald. That's very acceptable because the degree of roll between P7 and P7.2 is very small. So the club face is still relatively square to the club head arc in the early follow-through. Now I'm going to stop sharing images and I'm going to do some demonstrations. But before that, I do remember I have one more image to show you. Nearly forgot about this image. This is an image of a YouTube video made by Chuck Quinton, and his website is rotaryswing.com. And here is a video that he did many years ago called Yep, All Tour Pros Release the Golf Club the rotaryswing.com way. And here's an image of Rory McIlroy, and you can see that Rory McIlroy at this point, which is the P8 position, he's performing a release swivel action. Now, I'd encourage you to copy this title here, put it in a search engine so you can watch this Chuck Quinton video. And I believe that what Chuck Quinton says in this video is totally inaccurate. He claims that all professional golfers perform the golf swing release action the way that Chuck Quinton believes it should be done, which is basically the release swivel action. So he goes through a lot of golfers, and he features Jack Nicklaus and Sam Snead and other professional golfers, Freddie Couples and others, to show that they all perform the swivel action. But to me, a release swivel action is not really a hand release action if it's performed in the mid follow through or late follow through. So if you perform this type of release swivel action between P7 here and P7.2, like the previous image I showed you, that represents what I call a roller subtype of hand release action. And I don't see professional golfers using that. If you perform the release swivel action anytime after P7.4, that does not define a hand release action. That's just an optional choice that a professional golfer has if he wants to release the club up onto the swing plane. And I believe if you look at Rory McIlroy between P7 and P7.2, as I demonstrated, he uses a flipping subtype of non-drive hold release action. And this release swivel action that you can see here is just a very common phenomenon you see in professional golfers. After they've completed the hand release action between P7 and P7.2 or even up to P7.4, they find it biomechanically comfortable to perform a release swivel action so they can swivel the club shaft up the plane. So I'm going to stop sharing images now, and I'm going to go back and turn on my video camera. So here I am, and I'm going to do some demonstrations. So I always say the same thing when I do these demonstrations, that I've only got about 4 to 6 feet between this wall and my bed in my spare bedroom. And I've got a short club to demonstrate certain points. So let's talk about hand release actions. I mentioned to you that Will Zalatoris at P6 is in this position, and he does this motion. So he's starting to release the club, so the club shaft is catching up to his lead arm by impact. He's rotating the club to square the face because he uses a weak lead hand grip. And then at impact, he comes into impact looking like that. Small amount of forward shaft lean and a flat left wrist, like that. Now, between here and P7.4, he looks like this. Watch this. That's a drive hold. In other words, if you look at what I'm doing, this is not handle dragging. People say, oh, this, you just drag in the handle. No. Handle dragging is totally different. what he's doing basically, he's swinging fast. And what he's doing, because he has such perfect timing, he's letting his lead arm move towards the target at an angular velocity that matches the angular velocity of the club shaft. And if you do it with perfect timing, you can see you can still keep the alignment where the club shaft's in line with your radial bone roughly to there. Doesn't have to be perfect. So that's what he's doing. Now, what would you measure if I put a hack motion device on the back of my lead hand here? So if I put a hack motion device with a weak lead hand grip, it would probably show a small degree of palmar flexion. What would it show at that point? Theoretically, it should show the same value. That's if the club shaft moves at the same angular rotational speed as the lead hand. But in reality, it doesn't. And the reason is as follows. Even if you use a drive, hold, hand release action, you hear, notice I'll stand further back so you can see this better. Notice I have a bit of forward shaft lean, which means really the club shaft is slightly angled back relative to my lead arm. So when you get to here and it looks like it's in line with the lead arm, the club shaft is traveling marginally faster than your lead arm, even though visually it doesn't look that way. And a true measurement would show that the lead wrist is actually moving towards extension, but the mount is going to be very small. I would imagine it could be 5 degrees, but the idea that you keep in a constant value when you perform a drive, hold, and release action, which I used to claim was a true fact, I've now accepted it's not true. That if you come in with a weak grip and you come in through impact like I'm demonstrating, the lead wrist does go towards extension, but by such a small amount that it's hard to even see. And when you get to 7.4, you look like that. It still looks like you have an intact left arm flying wedge. Now, Rob Cheney, in his demonstrated, he did this. He had a moderately strong grip. He came into impact like this, and he had the same amount of forward shaft lean as Will Zalatoris. But the hack motion device said that he was extended by 14 degrees or 15 degrees. But that didn't mean that his lead wrist, when we talk of extension, we think of doing that. But he wasn't like that. He had the club shaft angled back relative to his lead arm. So the fact that the hack motion device said that he had an extended lead wrist, it's not measuring true extension. So this is the huge problem with a hack motion device, which I think that the majority of users who use it are totally unaware of. The hack motion device only measures, you say if you take your hand like that, a flat left wrist, and you extend it, it would measure how much you extend in it. But if you took your hand just like that, flat, and you just grip the club like that, it would measure extension, even though the club shaft's in line with your lead arm. So I'm going to hold the club shaft in line with my lead arm, like that, and I'm going to turn my hand to a stronger grip, like a neutral or moderately strong grip, and then I grip it. Now, I'm going to try and stand that I'm facing the camera. Notice that the club shaft's in line with my lead arm, but the hack motion device, you see, placed on the back of your hand, would claim that you extended. But what do you mean by extended? To me, extended is when your lead hand moves in that direction and the flying wedge becomes disrupted. So if you had a flying wedge here and you did that, yes, it's extended. But the hack motion device cannot know what you're actually doing. And this, to me, is a huge problem why I have zero faith in the value of a hack motion device. This is just my personal prejudice. It's that the device cannot measure it. Now I'm going to go to the, let's see if I can do it from this angle. So I said that if you use a drive hole and you get to P7.4, that's my definition. At this point, there are two options. You can do what Rob Cheney recommended. He says, when you get to here, you can start to cock up your wrists like that. And then as you complete the swing, you see how I'm angling the club shaft in that direction, not behind me. I'm angling it like that. Let me stand further away. Hopefully you'll see it better. So you drive hole to here, and then you go up and you finish like that. That's called a hold or finish action, which is what Rob Cheney recommended. But from my point of view, that's optional. I see a lot of professionals golfers do that with some of their shorter swings. But when you swing in a drive at a very fast speed and you're a drive holder like Will Zalatoris, after you get 0.7, 0.4, it's very comfortable to do this motion. See there? To get the club shaft to go this way around your body and then around your neck like that. And this is a release swivel action, so I'll demonstrate it. So you get to 7.4 and then you do that. So the fact that you'll see many golfers do this motion, a release swivel action, after P7.4 is a very common phenomenon. But that is not connected to what I call the different types of hand release actions. So I've demonstrated a drive hold like that. Now, Scotty Scheffler and Rory McIlroy and many pro golfers, when they swing in a drive at fast speed, as they come here, they had an intact left forearm flying wedge coming to impact, it's intact. But then they allow their left, see what I'm doing? The club is scrambling so fast. As they go through impact, you see how this has bypassed my arm. The left wrist is more bent. So if you measure the degree of left wrist bending in Rory McIlroy and Scotty Scheffler's swing, it's going to be more than a golfer like Will Zalatoris, who gets to there with less. They all bend the lead wrist if they use a weak or neutral grip. But the amount is going to be more if you use a flip-in subtype. However, the flip-in subtype is very commonly used by professional golfers. Now watch, as I start flipping a bit through impact, notice that the club face still stays square to the path because I'm not doing anything to roll it. If you performed a release swivel action at this point, then it would roll. But they don't. Rory McIlroy gets to here and he's flipped a bit, so he looks like that. But the club face is still square to the path. Then from here he starts at this point, Rory McIlroy looks like this, right? And that happens after P7.4. Now I mentioned to you the third type of hand release action was the rolling subtype. So this is what happens in the rolling subtype, as performed by golfers like Ernie Els, Tiger Woods, and many others. So they come into impact, they've got an intact flying wedge, they release the club, and as they release the club, if they use a weak or neutral grip, there's a significant amount of lead form supination. They come into impact looking like this. From here, they are starting to roll. So if you look at the P7 to P7.2 time period, the toe of the club slightly rolls faster than the heel of the club, which means there must be some roll motion in the arm. And as I said, if you look at it carefully, the humerus is rotating then externally rotating, while the lead form is also starting to supinate. So if you look at Tiger Woods or Ernie Els, between P7 at impact and P7.2, there's a very small amount of roll. But because it's slow, I regard that the amount of club face closing after impact has been so small that I think it's also a perfectly legitimate way to perform a hand release action. And then as Ernie Els gets beyond and Tiger Woods gets beyond here, you'll see that they transition into a release swivel action like that. And by P8, they've already looked like that. And it speeds up there. But that phenomenon where it speeds up and the club shaft starts to close very fast happens well beyond impact. I'm interested in the first 2 feet between P7 and P7.2, or even a little further to P7.3, and you want to keep the club face stable in that period. Now, this is the other technique which I refer to as a roller hand release action. So here I am coming into impact, and I start, if I've got a weak grip or a neutral grip, I'm starting to supinate. Watch this. See how much I'm supinating? It's like one continuous motion. When you do that, I'll do it at this level, so you can see the club face is rolling over, right? I do not see professional golfers doing this amount of roll. I refer to this amount of roll as a roller hand release action, and I don't see this happening in professional golfers. You know, I see it happen a lot in amateur golfers. Now, there's one golf instructor called A.J. Boner, and he recommends this technique. So he says, when you get to this position, he says, you need to actively roll take your trail palm and roll it over your lead palm like this, starting at about here, like that. And of course, I don't believe this happens in professional golfers because they are not actively using the trail arm to push the shaft and cause the shaft to roll over like that. And he calls it a hand crossover release action, and I don't see this phenomenon happening in professional golfers. So this is going to be part 1 of my series on hand release actions, and I strongly suspect I'll do some more video presentations on this topic, and if I do more, I'll call them part 2 or part 3 and so on. So I'm now going to stop this recording, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.